This poor man suffered a pretty gruesome death. His remains fit in a little bag.
A number of people affiliated with organized crime might have been involved.
There was just something wrong with that picture.
This case became driven by the forensic evidence.
There were bits of brain matter left on the ceiling.
I looked at the bullets and considered that maybe they had been used in a silencer.
Many murder cases are simple, but this case was very different.
He wasn't the nicest person in the world, but he didn't deserve to get murdered like that. I spent 33 years as an officer of the Metropolitan Police Department. My last 12 years were as a homicide investigator. I got into law enforcement because my father was a police officer. I remember him coming home with his uniform on and his brass buttons shining, and he's got a gun on his side and he puts bad guys in jail. And I thought, man, that's what I want to do. As an investigator, I'm often asked, what does a murderer look like? I tell people, look in the mirror. When my partner Jimmy and I were assigned to this case, it was the first big, major, high-profile investigation that we had received in homicide.
Detective Ramos.
Guns and drugs and sex and everything that people really want to sink their teeth into like some Hollywood movie. This case had it all. We received a call. Some fishermen were out at the lake, and they found something that scared them. It was a very typical desert scene outside of Las Vegas. And there was this charred area where someone had built a campfire, is what it appeared. There were the outlines and the remains of a humpback trunk, an antique-type trunk. And then, as we looked closer into this pit of burnt debris, we also saw small human remains. Bones, foot bones, finger bones. And 15 feet away was a perfectly intact human skull. And in fact, we could see bullet holes on the skull. Next to the skull was a gold bracelet that was encrusted in diamonds, and in those diamonds it spelled out the name Ron, R-O-N. Ron Rudin was a mysterious missing persons case. 4 weeks earlier, this well-known man had just vanished. One of his wives had given him a gold bracelet, and his name was spelled out in diamonds. We said, look, here's the bracelet. It's got to be Ron Rudin's skull.
Someone did as much as they could to conceal the remains, but the skull didn't burn all the way to disintegration.
A forensic anthropologist was able to look at the back of the skull where the vertebrae came in contact with the skull, and he said, I think I see some knife marks on these vertebrae. It's possible that the head had been removed from the body itself prior to the fire starting.
Decapitation occurs usually with some type of sharp instrument. The vertebrae are interlocked, and so there's really no way to take someone's head off of their body without chipping the bone. And that would let us know that it wasn't the fire that decapitated an individual, but a tool was used.
The skull had rolled away because it had been separated from the body. Somebody cut the poor man's head off and stuffed it in the trunk with them before they set it on fire.
The body was completely charred. The humpback trunk had been charred as well, leaving the clasps and some of the metal brackets behind.
But there was a couple pieces of wood that survived the fire that gave us an indication of what color the trunk was. We knew that it was blue on the outside and it had wallpaper on the inside. But there was still enough left where we could lay out the metal straps and we could get the overall dimensions of the trunk. This trunk had to be used to dispose of the body. The remains were taken to the medical examiner's office. During the examination of the skull, the medical examiner told us that there were 5 bullet holes, indicating that he had been shot 5 times. And in fact, I believe there were 3 bullet fragments that were still intact. We knew that it was a small caliber weapon, which was very fortunate because that was physical evidence of what was used to kill him. The only identifying item of evidence that was there was a gold bracelet. But the bracelet itself being there wasn't scientific proof that those remains belonged to Ron Rudin, so we had to get some scientific proof. We had dental records, and his teeth were still in place. Had it not been for that, I don't think we ever would have been able to scientifically identify those remains.
Fire has the ability to cover up a lot of crimes, but what it can't do is burn teeth. Teeth require 1500 degrees Fahrenheit or more to burn. Our teeth are pretty much protected from high temperatures. Each one of us have a unique set of teeth and a unique way our teeth have been restored. Those records that one gets when they go to the dentist gives us a really good tool in the identification of individuals.
The medical examiner was able to say, yeah, this is what's left of Ron Rudin, and now you have a murder case. We had to speak with the man's wife, his next of kin, the one who had to make the missing persons report. I called her up and I said, Margaret, there's been a development. And she said, oh, he's been found, hasn't he? We started to establish what we call a victimology. You try and find out everything you can about your victim, who he visited every day, what his habits were, what he would do before work, after work. We learned so many things about the private Ron Rudin versus the public Ron Rudin. In public, he was well-known, well-respected in the business community, a real estate developer who had millions, a workaholic like no one can describe. But he had a dark side. He was a playboy and he was unfaithful to every wife that he had. Ron would frequent topless bars, gentlemen's clubs. We had to listen to different stories about Ron and his background and the people that he associated with and the activities that he was involved in.
Ron was a colorful character, and so there were some allegations that he had been involved with gun dealers and some unsavory gun dealers. He had a very large gun collection, and there was the belief that he always carried a gun in his boot.
He also had a lot of enemies because of the way he conducted his real estate business. If you bought a home from Ron Rudin, he would finance it himself. But if you were one day late on your payment, he would foreclose and boom, you were out. And he made a lot of enemies that way. Ron Rudin suffered a pretty gruesome death. Some people said that was poetic justice for a man who lived a terrible lifestyle, a deceptive man, a very untrustworthy man. But he didn't deserve to get murdered like that. We started looking into what the circumstances were of his disappearance.
His black Cadillac was found not far from the Crazy Horse topless bar. Of course, the first thought was that somehow he had been apprehended there at the Crazy Horse.
The club was mob associated and owned by the mob. So there was a connection there for someone to say, well, the mob killed him and there's proof of it. Back in the 50s and 60s, the mob had a pretty big influence here in Las Vegas. They had quite a bit of ownership in a lot of the hotels. They skimmed a lot of money, and along with them running the hotels in Las Vegas came all the crime that was associated with the mob. Drug dealers, drug users, gamblers, prostitutes, and all. It's called Sin City for a reason. One of the things about the car being found at the Topless Club was that the car had been parked in the back alley of the club, where most patrons don't go. It's where the employees go, the dancers go, and that's where they park to get into the back door of the club. One of the bartenders was a former detective with our department. He had been convicted of going over to the dark side, joining the mob, and was part of their criminal activity in Las Vegas, a former police detective seduced by the mob. However, one of the things that we determined quickly was that there was no mob association between Ron Rudin and his activities. He wasn't involved in any competing business with the mob, and if the mob would have had anything to do with his disappearance, they're not going to put a key piece of evidence in one of their clubs. That's silly to think that. Somebody wanted us to believe the mob had something to do with his disappearance because his car's in the parking lot of a mob-owned Topless Club. It was a poor attempt to throw us off.
There was just a lot of leads, a lot of looking around. I mean, had he been at the Crazy Horse that night? Had he not? What was his car doing there?
There was an effort made to try to associate the vehicle with the crime scene and so forth. So we looked at soil and samples taken from the crime scene where the body had burned, looking for something to link that with debris from the floorboards of the car. Despite all my efforts, it just sort of went nowhere.
Inside the car were little specks of blood. But this blood was in such small amounts, it had no scientific value for us. All we could say is that it was human blood, but we couldn't type it. We couldn't get a DNA profile from it. The car didn't help us find out what happened to Ron Rudin. We got to find out all the other who, what, when, where, why questions. So we started talking to the people who reported him missing, and that's when we found out that his wife, Margaret, refused to report him missing for several days. She was telling all her family he's just gone somewhere. He does this all the time. 99% of murder investigations, the person that you've had to focus on first is the one who is closest to the victim. Spouse, live-in boyfriend, girlfriend, something like that. We wanted to move past Margaret if she had nothing to do with it.
Margaret Rudin was a very attractive woman, always very gracious, very gentle and kind in the way she presented herself.
Margaret's hobby was collecting antiques, and she had opened an antique store in Ron's strip mall that he owned attached to his home.
They were an attractive couple. He was an attractive man and she was an attractive female, and people tend to take notice of attractive people in that regards. Two socialites getting together and both being very connected here in town.
We called up and said, Margaret, can we come and speak to you right now? And she said, sure, come on up. So we go to the house, and I said, well, Margaret, we need to sit down and we need to go over everything you can remember about the last time you spoke to him. What happened? What did you guys talk about? Where were you? And she says, oh, okay, yeah, but I'm just so upset right now. Can you give me a minute? And we said, yeah, of course. And she goes over to the desk that had been left open, and she starts going through all these papers. And I said, Margaret, is there anything we can help you with? She goes, well, no, I'm just looking for his insurance policy. And I thought, okay, well, what about what happened to my husband? How did he die? Where did you find him? Your husband's been murdered. We need to talk about what happened. I'm watching her, and I said, again, we need to talk and refresh your memory. The last time you saw him, what were you doing? And she starts going like this. She's digging her first knuckle into her eye.
I understand it.
To myself, I'm thinking, what are you doing? You're gonna hurt yourself.
You okay, man?
And it occurred to me she was trying to make herself cry. She was trying to injure her eye so that tears would come out.
A friend nearby that we can call?
No.
She said, I'm just too upset to talk anymore. Can you just come back at another time? And we said, sure, of course, we understand. So Jimmy and I looked at each other and, we kind of shook our heads, and the reaction was just not what we had expected. I had never seen a reaction like that in the 300-plus murders that I've investigated. She wasn't crying. She wasn't upset. She was just like we're having an everyday conversation. In the meantime, in the back of our minds, we were saying this lady had something to do with her husband's disappearance. We get to the office, and Jimmy and I are just looking at each other and saying, what in the world is this woman up to? And then, as we walk in the door, Jimmy's phone is ringing on his desk. Hello, Detective Vaquero. It was an attorney. And he said, I've been retained by Margaret Rudin. If you want to talk to her, you have to talk to me first. We didn't even get a chance to get back to the office before she lawyered up, as we call it. So we thought, okay, here we go. The game's on. We could not focus on anybody else until we eliminated her as a suspect. We thought, have we covered every base? Is there any possibility that there was someone other than Margaret responsible for Ron's murder? Every single lead that came in, we followed up on it. Every single one. We didn't discard any lead that we had. One of the theories that Margaret had proposed was that Ron had been abducted by Colombian drug lords. Vegas was a hub for gang activity, and Las Vegas did play a role in the distribution of cocaine that was coming in from South America. Margaret would say, well, he's been running guns to Colombian drug lords for years. He was licensed by the government to sell firearms. He had an amazing collection of guns. He converted his walk-in closet into a huge gun safe. There had to be 500 guns in this closet. Margaret tried to expand on that and try and make it a plausible theory, but while we were able to document that he was going to South America with guns, he wasn't running guns for the Colombian drug cartel. They were for hunting expeditions. He would only take one shotgun with him. This story was another red herring.
Remember the date?
And from that point on, we really started digging, and we found a lot of bizarre things about Margaret.
She, like Ronald, had been married many times.
Her marriage to Ron was her 5th marriage. Each ex-husband was very wealthy. Ron had substantial wealth. Some estimates were upwards of $13 million. She married into money, hoping that she would live a lifestyle of the rich and famous. But from day one, this marriage was tumultuous.
The relationship became very turbulent. It was clear to me that the trust had been lost in that relationship.
They fought all the time. There was a domestic violence incident where there was actually shots fired in the house. In fact, not long after Ron had married Margaret, he discovered that one of his weapons was missing.
He had indicated that he believed she might have taken the gun.
Ron's will spelled out, if I die under mysterious circumstances or have a violent death, he wanted an extraordinary investigation done, and that if anybody was going to kill him for his money, he didn't want them to get his money. Ron's closest friends told us Margaret wiretapped his office and put listening devices on his phones.
She ultimately had the ability to intercept and listen to each one of his phone calls.
She could hear his phone conversations with 1 or 2 of these women that he was having an affair with.
She not only learned of his infidelity, but by intercepting his phone calls, what Margaret was learning is that Ron was actively changing his will. Her amount that she'd receive under the will was getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Her antique store was doing terrible, failing, costing Ron a lot of money. He had given her thousands of dollars to get this off the ground. He told her on the night before he disappeared that he was cutting off her allowance for the store. He was turning off her cell phone, and he was turning in her Lincoln Continental that she was leasing. And so Margaret's cash cow was drying up.
We believed that there was an awful lot of financial motive in having him killed.
However, we had no direct physical evidence linking Margaret to the crime. We prepared a press release. It was a murder investigation now. And then we received a call from a young man who identified himself as Augustine Lovato. And he had a very interesting story to tell us.
Detective Ramos.
And that just turned everything upside down.
Okay. Bye.
Augustine Lovato says, I have information about that Ron Rudin case. He begins to tell us that the lady whose husband was killed hired me to clean up their bedroom. And we said, what? She said that her husband had a bloody nose, and he got blood on the mattress, and there was blood on the carpet, so she wanted me to clean it up. He says there was a pool of blood on the entire top half of the mattress, and it was just stinky and nasty. I said, you're sure it's blood? He goes, I'm positive it's blood. And he said, and right below the bed, on the carpet, it was soaked with blood. And he said, and then I looked on the wall above the headboard, and there was one of these glamour shots of the lady, and there were little droplets of blood on the picture. And as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how did the blood from a bloody nose get up on this picture? And he said, it just gave me the creeps, but she was paying me to get rid of it, so I did what the lady told me to do. He told us where he had taken the mattress, and we drove there, and there it was, sitting right there, soaked in blood. Boom. We were on the right track with Margaret. We were able to get a search warrant based on the evidence that we collected from Augustine Lovato's statement. So we served the search warrant on the house. We had to find conclusive evidence that a crime had occurred in that specific location. One of the techniques that we used was spraying a chemical agent called luminol in the bedroom where we theorized that Ron had been killed.
Luminol is a chemical that is used to help detect trace amounts of blood that may be found at a crime scene. So luminol is typically sprayed on an area that you think has blood, and the luminol actually interacts with the iron found in hemoglobin to create a blue light that you see for a quick moment.
We sprayed the luminol, and this wall lit up like the Milky Way. It was just glowing with blood. Blood that was not visible to the naked eye because whoever, and we believe it was Margaret, had tried to clean the blood off of the wall.
Removing blood is almost impossible. As much as you try and scrub and clean, there will still be the smallest amount that's left.
There's a phenomenon in criminalistics called high-velocity mist. We believe that when the first bullet entered his skull, it created a hole. And when the subsequent bullets entered the skull, the pressure that was inflicted on the inside of the skull caused a mist of blood to come out in the existing holes.
High-velocity mist has a very unique spray or aerosol-like pattern that's very distinguishable from something like a passive drop. Say if you cut your hand or if you were to be hit with a bat, it wouldn't create the same pattern.
There were actual bits of brain matter and skull matter that was still left on the ceiling. But then another bizarre twist in this case happened. We found out that one of Ron's wives, I believe it was his third wife, this lady had committed suicide on that bed, shot herself in the head, and the blood spray from that incident was still present on the wall.
With blood, the amazing thing is if something happened 20 years ago, there's very much a high likelihood that that blood would still be there.
And we had to research that and find out, well, this blood pattern here belonged to Ron Rudin when he was killed. This blood pattern here belonged to his wife when she committed suicide.
If you suspect that there's multiple blood profiles that are in a room, you could use a lot of things to actually separate them out. So one may be the actual blood spatter analysis, where you're looking at the direction, the size, the shape of the spots. But then furthermore, you may do some DNA testing.
We had no base DNA identity for Ron. Ron did not have any children. You know, if you have offspring, you can get a DNA profile from your offspring, but he didn't have any. We found a handkerchief on Ron's side of the sink that had little droplets of blood on it, and we learned from his maid that Ron would dab himself with that handkerchief when he cut himself shaving. That was the only reference that we had to Ron's DNA profile. We needed to match the DNA profile from the droplets of blood on the handkerchief with all the other blood that we believed was Ron's because of the circumstances. But there was still that little 1% chance of, well, how do you know this is Ron Rudin's DNA? Couldn't it have been a stranger? I suppose it could have. That just caused us to dig our heels in more and just focus on what we had and go out and find more evidence.
It was believed that his body was placed in a humpback trunk. The trunk was believed to have been an antique piece.
We knew that it was blue on the outside and it had wallpaper on the inside from what was left at the crime scene. I found a receipt in Margaret's files that described the purchase of a humpback trunk with the interior with wallpaper, and spelled it out, and the dimensions matched the dimensions of the framework, and I thought, found it. So I called the dealer, gave him the receipt number and described the trunk. He says, yeah, I remember selling that trunk to that really nice lady from Las Vegas. He described it perfectly. The evidence that we had all pointed to Margaret. To this point, it's all circumstantial, but we were hoping that we would get more evidence to follow up on. So we took the case to a grand jury.
When we began to present this case to the grand jury, we were presenting it more to gather up evidence, to find out just what the state of the evidence was.
Margaret was not cooperating with us, wasn't telling us anything. We were not permitted to speak to Margaret without a lawyer present. But when you're the focus of an investigation by a law enforcement agency and evidence is being presented to a grand jury, the target of that investigation has the opportunity to go in front of the grand jury and defend themselves. But they don't have the right to have an attorney present during that examination. We were hoping that Margaret would avail herself to defend her actions, but she never did. She never did take that opportunity. In our minds, the evidence was all there. But we were looking at it from our point of view, from a cop's point of view, and they said, we just don't have enough. And as an investigator, it's very frustrating. I thought this case was stalled. I thought it's going to be a cold case. After the initial thrust of the investigation calmed down, we still had other cases to work. But in our downtime, we were always focusing on what are we missing on the Rudin case? What else can we do on the Rudin case?
Stu Bell was the elected DA at the time, and he had come down and seen me and indicated that this case was growing old, and he wanted to do something about it. And so Stu Bell gave me the assignment of presenting it to a second grand jury. The forensic evidence, the blood evidence in the room, all over the ceiling, on the floor, on the carpets, became a very important part of this case.
We needed conclusive scientific proof that, yes, indeed, that blood belonged to Ron Rudin. The handkerchief was the only reference that we had to Ron's DNA profile. Now, one could argue that, well, how do you know that was Ron's blood that was on that handkerchief? A good defense attorney is going to work on that and beat it to death. At that time, DNA profiling was in its infancy. and Ron's living relatives weren't close enough that we could have gotten a DNA profile from them. On most murder scenes, you have a body bag and you have a full-size body that you take to the medical examiner. Poor Ron, in this case, his remains fit in a little bag. It was just a skull and some burnt bones. However, during the grand jury presentation, we were able to extract DNA from the teeth that were in the skull.
If a body is completely burned and there's no tissue, teeth are going to hold up. In the tooth is the nutrient center called the pulp, and that pulp has a location where there's a rich source of DNA. That pulp can be used to compare against the blood from the victim you have.
We removed the pulp from the tooth in Ron Ruden's skull and said, yep, the blood on the mattress, the blood on the ceiling, the blood on the wall all have the same DNA profile as the tooth that was in the skull found out at the lake. It was one of the very first times that the pulp in the tooth was used to identify a DNA profile. In fact, it was one of the first times here in Las Vegas that it was admitted as evidence in court. We've got a pretty good case on Margaret. We just need that one little bit more to tip the scales in our favor.
The grand jury had been convened, and having looked at the trace evidence, I was part of that. I was called to testify. And during one of the breaks, I heard the deputy district attorney talking to one of the crime scene analysts saying, well, next week, bring in the bullets. We'll get those entered into evidence. And I went on alert, and I said, immediately I said, bullets? What bullets? We've not examined any.
The bullets and the bullet fragments that were found within the skull were deformed to the point that they were still identifiable, but just barely identifiable.
The forensic pathologist had looked at them and said they were too damaged, they were of no value, and so the detectives just never submitted a request on those. In this case, the bullets did look very damaged, but it turned out that a lot of the marks on them, which were very, very coarse marks, were actually gun marks. I kept thinking, what could cause this kind of coarse character to the marks? And one of the possibilities that came to mind, that maybe a suppressor or a silencer had been used. And so in my efforts to evaluate that, I thought, where can I get some samples of bullets from a silencer for comparison? And I remembered a gun recovered under unusual circumstances.
In the summer of 1996 at Lake Mead, there was an area that was reserved for scuba diving. This one diver saw a white plastic bag on the bottom of the lake. They opened it up, and wow, there was a .22 semi-automatic pistol with a silencer in it. The park ranger called the police department. He called us, the homicide section, but that information hadn't been passed on to Jimmy and I, so we weren't aware of it.
The gun had been wrapped in countless plastic baggies, baggie after baggie after baggie. Certainly, it was hoped that the gun would never be found again.
They said it was a bull barrel Ruger, which is a term for a target barrel gun. And as soon as I looked at it, I realized it was not a bull barrel, it was a suppressor, a silencer. When a gun is fired, the bullet exits the barrel, and behind it is a wave of high-pressure gas, and that is what you perceive as sound. A suppressor delays that wave exiting, makes it take a little longer to get out, and so the sound is reduced. It's more of a poof. Because it was a little unusual, we proceeded to clean it and put it back together and test fire. Okay, we've got a .22 short here. Chamber's loaded. We looked at the bullets, but we couldn't link it to anything. So the gun went to the evidence vault where it was stored, and the test fires went into our evidence storage in the laboratory. Later on, when the grand jury had been convened, I remembered the test fires from the gun from the lake, and so I pulled those out of evidence to see if the marks from a silencer were similar to the marks I was seeing on the bullets that killed Ron Ruden. As I put those test fires from the suppressed weapon on my scope and compared them to the bullets removed from Ron Ruden's head, I started seeing what appeared to be the marks lining up. And of course I'm thinking, this is just a random gun found in the lake. This can't be. But the more I looked, it became clear to me that there was a relationship between those bullets and the gun from Lake Mead. So I made some inquiries with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and found that there was a record of this gun. It had belonged to Ron Ruden. I called the DA and I said, you are not going to believe this, but I've got the gun that killed Ron Ruden. And his response was, what?
The eureka moment was the gun. The gun being identified as, number one, the murder weapon, number two, that it had belonged to Ron, and number three, that it disappeared shortly after Margaret came into the picture. That was the coup de grace moment. Who else is going to be in the man's bedroom with that gun at 2 o'clock in the morning when he's asleep to be in a position to shoot him in the head 5 times? The grand jury began deliberations around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock they had given us a true bill or an indictment and said, yep, there's enough evidence here to hold her for trial. Go get her, boys. Margaret knew that we were coming after her. but Margaret Rudin had disappeared off the face of the earth. Once the grand jury indictment was handed over, we realized Margaret Rudin was gone. She took off and was in the wind. Both Jim and I looked at each other and said, "Here we go, the hunt is on." We had no idea where to start looking, so we just entered her into a national database, listed all of her aliases. While she was on the run, Margaret kept 2 or 3 different wigs, a couple bottles of hair dye. She went to great lengths to conceal her identity, and she was successful at it for a while, for almost 2 years. Phoenix Police Department received a tip. The caller said, "This woman that's wanted is my neighbor." A Phoenix police officer responded to that call, but we weren't able to get a photograph to him in time. This officer actually spoke to Margaret. He said, "Do you know who Margaret Rudin is?" "Oh, no, sir, I have no idea. Who is she?" "Well, she's wanted for murder." "No, that couldn't possibly be me." Later on, he went back to find her. She had gone at a moment's notice. She just took off. From Arizona, she ended up in Mexico. We had gotten another series of tips, and they said, "Yeah, she's in Mexico. I know that because friends are speaking to her and they know where she is." Margaret had a series of friends, a little communication network that she would use, and that's how she was able to contact her family, and they were able to contact her. Ultimately, one of her friends said, "Enough is enough. I'm not going to be part of this helping a fugitive," and called the FBI and said, "I know how to get a hold of where Margaret's at. She's no longer in Mexico. She's in a little town named Revere." It was a suburb of Boston. It was one of the best takedowns that I can remember. It was a classic piece of stick and whistle 101. The cops in Revere saw a pizza delivery guy go to the apartment. So the cops stopped the pizza delivery kid as he walked away. The cops put on the pizza delivery uniform, a little hat and a jacket, and they went back and knocked on the door. And they said, "Margaret, do you know why we're here?" And she said, "Yeah, it's about that Vegas thing." She fought extradition. We had to wait for a governor's warrant, and once she got back to Vegas, she had 3 attorneys defending her.
I don't mean to say that many murder cases are simple, but many murder cases are simple. There's eyewitnesses that are left. There's a smoking gun. The murderer is standing over the body many times. This case was very different in that regard. We had to be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why each and every piece of evidence became so important to us.
It was hours and hours and hours of, good old-fashioned police work, bolstered by a new science that was just being brought into police work.
The finding of the gun in the lake and the ballistics matching the projectiles that were found in Ronald Rudin's skull and in his remains became overwhelmingly powerful, at least in the eyes of the state.
Between the ballistics and the DNA, they both came together and gave us that final piece of evidence, irrefutable evidence, that she was responsible for this poor man's death, and a gruesome death at that. It's sad to think that this poor guy was killed by one of his own guns. I guess that old adage, live by the sword, die by the sword, sure turned out to be the case here.
Of course, the jury had the last say in this matter.
After about a month-long trial, she was convicted and received a sentence of 20 to life for her part in Ron's murder. And she's still in jail today. It's a classic story of greed, power, money, revenge, I can tell you just about everybody's capable of becoming a murderer at some point. If you piss somebody off enough, they're gonna take their revenge on you.
Bring a nigga from the 9-1. Switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Saw you when